This is hell.
The Trump administration has been repeatedly criticized for not having a plan to address climate change and of being in denial of any pending doom extreme weather will bring. But as our first guest argues, Trump is not in denial and does have a plan. And it's a very, very, very scary plan. Here to explain, senior and founding editor of N+1 magazine, Marco Roth, is the lead writer of an article by N+1's editors, The Best of a Bad Situation. This is what extinction feels like from the inside, which appears in Overtime, the winter 2019 edition of N+1. Welcome to This Is Hell, Marco.
Thanks, Chuck.
You can find all of the writing of N+1 at n+1mag.com. That's all spelled out, N+1mag. You write 10 or 15 years ago, it was possible to think of the polar bear and the white rhinoceros as martyrs dying off to shame us into better harmony with the natural world, not ruined archaic torsos, but videos of extinct creatures would say, you must change your life. I'm going to continue that quote in a little bit, but why do you think shaming us into fighting climate change, why didn't that work?
That's a great question. That's a perfect lead question. There was a feeling that we were in a kind of liberal mode of educating the public into understanding climate change and understanding what was happening to us. And so all of the bag of tricks that kind of worked in the 70s for the ecological movement were pulled out. So you had animal videos, you had great reporting, Elizabeth Kolbert in the New Yorker, who I read about later in the article. But the broadcast for that somehow didn't reach the people that it was supposed to reach, which were the people in oil companies and elsewhere who had another plan. And I think, as you point out in your intro, a lot of us still would like to believe that the problem with climate change is ignorance, that there's denial, that there's lack of knowledge. But I think we've reached a point now where it's clear that when you have willed ignorance, which is what this is, from the administration and from other sources, willed ignorance, there's nothing you can do. So you can show a video of a refugee, of a polar bear. That's not going to move someone who is determined so hard not to see. Or not to believe that that's a problem.
You write that a dark glimmer of progressive thinking, the bargaining phase, as it were, was discernible in the Kyoto Protocol and at the Paris Conference, where the Prime Minister of Tuvalu's call to impose a strict, not-to-be-exceeded target of a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature, the minimum required to save his people from a homeless future in a world hostile to refugees and immigrants, was dismissed in favor of pragmatic mitigating maneuvers intended to induce the cooperation of holdout nations such as the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. Now, the 5 stages of denial are anger, bargaining, depression, and then you also have acceptance. Have we moved on from bargaining to depression, or have we even gone further into acceptance of climate change? And to what extent can acceptance actually lead to finally fighting against climate change?
It's interesting that you bring up the 5 stages of grief in that way, because I have an ongoing. Now we're getting into both individual and mass psychology. I always felt like the 5 stages of grief were they're not actually stages, that they're always present. So the notion that you move through these as like phases in history is itself a kind of progressive thinking. Whereas in fact these stages are there at every moment in the grieving process. So have we moved into the? I think there's we may have shuttled back into from the Republican side, the denial stage, and certainly from the side of people who understand what's happening to the Earth, the anger stage. I could actually be in favor of more anger, more anger rather than acceptance, because there are certain things to assume that this is a grieving process is to assume that we really can't do anything about it. And that moment of acceptance, I think, has yet to come and would be very dangerous politically if we thought we were in the acceptance phase. It's funny, also in the passage that you just read, it made me realize, first of all, that Tuvalu needs to be, it comes at you in the sentence when you read it aloud more than I expected when I wrote it. It's nice to see Tuvalu there. It's a small island in the Pacific, but their prime minister was like, if you don't stick to a strict 1.5 Celsius temperature limit, we don't exist, and we will all become refugees. And there was even a moment where they threatened to immediately emigrate to Europe, which scared the Europeans because nobody wants refugees. That, however, that didn't work. But I think what we've seen with climate change negotiations, carbon limit negotiations, this is also happening in the background of the Gilets jaunes protest movement in France, that these small steps occasion these huge reactions. And this is also the same we saw this with the healthcare law in the United States, where there was a preemptive attempt to negotiate with with people with the idea that we could just gradually ease ourselves into carbon reduction or ease ourselves into having a better healthcare system, that we wouldn't antagonize the insurance companies, we wouldn't antagonize the oil companies, we would give them time to maybe switch over into renewable energy sources. I mean, Exxon has billions of dollars. Why don't they invest in alternative energy? They would be very well positioned to do so. That's not their model. And so even the smallest attempts at amelioration have been met with these massive pushbacks that you would expect, if you were proposing the most radical solution. So why not actually at this point think about the most radical solutions to climate change, which would be completely decoupling the economy from carbon-based fuels and carbon-based energy sources?
You write that whatever they may say or tweet, the Trump administration is not in denial about climate change. In fact, it has the perverse distinction of being the first U.S. administration to address it head-on. How do you see the Trump administration not being in denial about climate change and about addressing it head-on?
Well, I think this is the counterintuitive move that we are asking readers of this essay to make, right? Which is as I said at the beginning, this thought was that you could educate people, and that there was a that this is a distinguished tradition in thinking about evil and wrong, going back to Aristotle, in which all evil is only ignorance. People only do things that are bad out of a lack of knowledge. That, I think, turns out not to be true. And I think that what the Trump administration has shown us is that, these are people who I think on a deep level, I'm not talking about Trump himself. I have no idea what is in that person's mind. I don't want to know. I don't think anybody knows. But the people that he surrounded himself with. So in this case, I don't even think this is a Trump problem. This is a Republican Party problem. The Pruitts, the Zinks, that cast of characters that we know. They understand that climate change is happening. They understand something of they're aware that there are more storms, that the average temperatures are going up. That they may not have a great nuanced understanding of feedback loops in the way that the science has shown. It's possible that these things can in fact accelerate very quickly. That we're not just like steady. We're not slowly increasing carbon levels. Like carbon, begets carbon. The ice sheets melt. This is creating. So they're the timeline that we're being given even is slightly more alarming than people are aware of. But their feeling is, this is like an investment opportunity for us. And if somebody was like, hey, there's going to be dramatically fewer resources, but you can control more of them, their understanding of this is like, oh yeah, like we could win this. We could game plan for how to, I want my family to survive, but I don't care about anybody else's family. So I'm just going to plan things so my family survives and not your family. And I don't, who cares about the refugees? We want to win the future future is like a scorched earth future. They're trained to understand that they need to be in the best position. They will be the last person standing with their family, or in a bunker, on a hill. It's the survivalist response to climate change. So I think rather than calling it climate change denial, I mean, we could even call it climate change survivalism, and that expresses more clearly the attitude of the administration, which is basically, we can't do anything to stop this, except that. So at this point, we have to make sure that we are in a position where we're not going to die, and that we is not America. The we is not a lot of people. The we is the Trump family mafia state model, and this is also true in Russia, where you have a mafia state. Anywhere where you have a narrow oligarchic state, it's very difficult to fight climate change, because the people in charge is like, hey, like, we could move somewhere, we could up sticks to Canada. And if you see where, it's interesting that the Gulf nations are very smart in how they've been buying land outside the Gulf states, and what they're planning to do with it. And because they also know that Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, these are states that are not going to be habitable in 30 to 40 years.
So why do you think that individual survivalist reaction to climate change, why do you think that proved so popular enough for Trump to win the Electoral College? Why do you think that ends up being more popular than any kind of collective response we can make, so more people would survive the worst aspects of abrupt climate change?
Yeah, I think, it's not as though the election was presented as a moratorium on or referendum on responses to climate. And as we know, I mean, the Democratic Party has been very shy about running on this issue until recently. So for voters, it's not, I think it's not something that people really vote on consciously. But you're kind of asking, what is the appeal? What is the appeal of Trump in certain ways? Which is, and it is the offer, and I think we saw it. We can see this in various other forms, like with the economy, where it's a zero sum thing, where it's like, you are in direct competition. Direct competition is nasty. You will have to, if somebody's coming into the country, they're going to take your job, even if that's not true. If somebody is, so the attitude down the line is one of the refusal of collectivity, and there's always the sense of, you can make it as a solo individual. And I think we're also like culturally prepped for this in so many ways. The popularity of shows like The Walking Dead, these apocalyptic scenarios, in which it's always about the reality shows like Naked and Afraid. Like there's this weird moment in the culture where it's like people are being socialized into being decivvilized, and thinking that they can somehow make it on their own as long as they work out in the right way, get enough guns and canned food. And this this goes deep in the American unconscious, the frontier ethos. But in this case, it becomes it's hard to people forget that the rhetoric of the frontier was also about conquering and using nature. That nature is not going to be available anymore to be conquered or used. Like that, there will not be resources out there in the wilderness. This is not a wilderness kind of issue. This is a survival of the planet issue. So it really does require. I think it's easier for people who live in cities, strangely, to have a sense of what collective action is. Or would look like, or it's easier for people who also live in communities that have a relationship to ecological cycles, a strong relationship to ecological cycles, to understand how they could act collectively. But there's so much mist around. How do I get my energy to my house? Most people don't even know that, right? So would they know where their local power plant is? Would they know what's behind the local power plant? And if they could understand how easily the switch to alternative energy could be done, they might in fact even be on board with a collective solution.
So in the face of climate change, do we empathize with zombies that have no idea of what's taking place around them? And if we do, what does that reveal to you about us and the way that we do see and react to and respond to climate change?
Yeah, well, right, there's always this question about who are the zombies, and I think everyone has different answers to this. I mean, my answer in the essay is that the zombies are actually us, but they're the displaced us. So it's one more way of allowing individuals to think like, oh, I'm not responsible for this human catastrophe that's unfolding. It's these other humans that are responsible. I mean, we're all responsible. So we do have to empathize. And there is, so I'm not saying that education is impossible on this topic. That we shouldn't assume people learn more, but we should assume that there is a strong broadcast from the Republican Party, those with interest in the Republican Party, particularly the oil industry, and also like the Koch brothers with their plastics and paper interest, in obscuring the problem just to the point where they can like get enough profits and money hoarded away so that they can save themselves. So if you're not in the 1% category, anybody not in the 1% category needs to come up with a collective solution to climate change, and that does have to happen through education. Part of the point of this essay, though, was to deal with the sense that there are people who already know, and then how do they feel with what is it like going through the day with the knowledge that even everything that you know is not helping right now. And to point, to say it's probably not helping because you're not going to educate the 1% on this. The 1% has decided what they want to do about it. And again, there are some progressive billionaires out there who would actually like to live in a world that is not a warmed husk. And then the other thing is it's very hard to imagine what you can I personally, I mean, I've been writing about this for a while, and every time I'm like, what would the world look like with not just sea level rise, but complete deforestation, with desertification. It becomes, it's an exercise in really, like, if you can imagine it, it's probably going to be worse than what you can imagine at the end stage. So I keep running up against this. I think, well, who wants to say, is my imagination really the limit on the worst that could happen? And I have to say, as a human being, no, because the failure of human imagination is part of what has brought us into this, edge of the cliff position that we're in.
You also write that we need to ditch the patriarchal models of wealth and status reproduction that have been constitutive of nearly all expansionist, war-making, and resource-depleting societies of the past 10,000 years. Do we have to, is it necessary for us to end patriarchy in order to end climate change? Because I'm not too sure which one we're going to be better at changing.
In some ways, one will be the effect of the other. I could imagine an end to patriarchy that would not solve an end to climate change. Or that would not really ameliorate climate change. The other thing is, like, we're not going to end climate change. We're just going to, we're going to put the brakes on something that will, if we're lucky, we're going to end up in back into a 300-year cycle of carbon reduction that will mitigate the 300-year cycle of carbon accumulation that we've been in, shooting up since the advent of the steam engine. What would have to happen, though, is that there would have to be. I mean, it is very deeply wired into human patriarchal societies that one way to deal with conditions of stress and scarcity in the culture is to go out and plunder and conquer other cultures. That's the model that would no longer function under climate change, although that's the one that we're starting to kind of see very scarily. so far it's been a defensive response. I think one has to see the immigration paranoia in this country as an aspect of fear of climate change. This is certainly true elsewhere in the world, in Hungary, which I believe you'll be talking about later, and in Burma, where you have again the rise of ethnic distinctions that are, if there's a small ethnic minority that is in a vulnerable position, as resources across the board dwindle, that ethnic minority is going to be in trouble. So that's what would have to happen. I mean, again, we're in the position of we're not nobody's gonna fight their way out of this problem. There are no more worlds left to conquer. We're not going to go to Mars, and even if we did go to Mars, wouldn't we still want Earth and Mars? So all of the kind of the zero sum thinking that is part of that we use, that helped build a great American empire by taking stuff away from other people, that's not going to work. So that's really the challenge, and that's what's behind that patriarchy sentence.
And you mentioned how the immigration debate is also steeped in climate change. How much is the immigration debate today, in your opinion, the result of climate change? If it is, what explain to you why so rarely we hear climate change mentioned in the debate over immigration and borders?
Yeah, I think that climate change, and part of what the article argues is that there's this counterintuitive move that you have to accept that denial is not denial out of ignorance. Denial is denial when you know something is happening and you don't want to see it. So everybody knows a little bit about climate change. It has created an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety. It's created an atmosphere of pervasive scarcity, so that we already feel that we live in this atmosphere of scarcity, and that everything is under threat. And so with this undercurrent of anxiety about a real global problem, you also have, it allows other anxieties that are near the surface to be played upon. And so immigration, in the sense that elsewhere in the world, I mean, this is all, especially it's more the case in Europe, where the Europeans are freaking out about refugees coming over from Africa and the Middle East. But the U.S. has now borrowed its immigration politics from the European right wing, and I mean the notion that somehow there isn't. I'm always bemused when I talk to I have a good friend in Denmark, and he's like, "Aren't you worried about all these immigrants coming in because there's not enough land?" And we're like, "Okay, that's true in Denmark, but nobody lives in South Dakota. Nobody lives in Montana. America is full of these empty states, and we, with the right planning, imagine if somebody planned an ecological community that was running, off renewable energy sources. You could build a city in any of these places that could house, millions of people, and it wouldn't be a problem. So yes, I think the thing that seems to be triggering everyone in the U.S. about is this idea that somehow we are also facing a scarcity crisis, a scarcity of land, a scarcity in the labor market, and these crises are all manufactured. But the climate change anxiety, I think, makes it easier for politicians like Trump and Steve King to demagogue on immigration issues.
You're right, we are everyday climate deniers, the way we are everyday death deniers. Are we in the same kind of denial about climate change as we are about death? Has any unwillingness to come to terms with our own mortality also led to us not coming to terms with climate change, that there's just something inherent about the human spirit that we just don't want to think about death, and that's what leads us to...
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a version of the boomer problem, where, the sense of, we know we're going to die, and the boomers being the great, they're like, yeah, but I'm just hitting the prime of life, and 60, at 65, I can do whatever I want. I'm going to spend my resources trying to live forever in exactly the way that I've lived before. And that's a form of death denial, in which on some level you're going. These people still know they're going to die. They're just not ready to understand what dying is like, and to come to terms with death as an aspect of life. So I think what climate change has shown us, or should show us, is that our civilization, this carbon-based, massively exploitative, rapacious thing that we've been living in, in a grand sweep, really, when one can go back to the steam engine here, that civilization is ending, and we know that civilization is ending, even if we don't admit it. The question is, what civilization are we preparing? And to accept one's death in a certain way would also mean to prepare those that come after us to have a good life, right? And to say, I may not have had the opportunity for these things in my life, but the next generation will have that opportunity. Or in this case, I would like the next generation, my children's generation, to be able to breathe. I would like them to be able to go swimming. I would, think basic things, without getting their skins burned off by an acidified ocean, or stung to death by jellyfish. Or have access to fresh water. We're now back to very basic things, but that's the kind of civilization that we would have to prepare. And so to accept climate change is to accept that the civilization that we're in is dying and needs to die, and will die, and that death can be angry and chaotic and nasty and full of war, and it could be a really in the end, the ends of civilizations are not pretty usually, but we do have this opportunity as a species to create the possibility of another civilization that would take over from the carbon-based civilization that has been ruling. That's been pretty much the paradigm for 300 years.
You write about LED bulbs. One of the few successful attempts to reduce carbon emissions in the United States in the 21st century.
Were you going to say a bright spot?
I was not going to. Resulted in the slow replacement of though I do love puns, heat-generating yellow incandescent light bulbs with cold white-blue light-emitting diodes. But the back-of-envelope math suggests that even if every incandescent bulb used in the United States for residential and commercial applications were replaced by its diode equivalent, the likely total differential would be a percentage point of our total energy use. How much do token actions and policies like this distract us from addressing climate change? Or do they actually help us address climate change because they allow for or make us more tolerant of government and industry intrusions in our life that affect a kind of change in our lifestyles that could help us fight climate change?
Yeah, and that's another great question that I don't have hard and fast answers to. I think we've certainly seen that there's an ambivalence in any reformist type initiative. With carbon cap and trade, this idea that poorer nations will trade their carbon credits to richer nations, so the richer nations can keep polluting, and these poorer nations will have to come up with they'll have to do something else. They'll have to draw their water from the well by hand, just the way they did for thousands of years. There's a little condescension in that, and as we've seen also with things like attempts to do regressive gas taxes in France, that really, that kind of move really backfires when you say we're going to reduce your quality of life to the middle and lower classes in order to save the earth. And they look around and they're like, yeah, but you're still driving, your your gas guzzling car, and you can afford to pay the extra tax, and this is not a fair exchange. Like, why do I have to bear the burden of saving the earth or those polar bears that you like to talk about? Fuck you. I'm going to go. Pardon me, I got to say that on the air. I knew it was live radio. I'm going to protest against the tax and your government, and then and the polar bears can go to hell. Or, in this case, the planet can go to hell. So the light bulb thing is the light bulb thing was the comic moment in the essay. And always it was important to have a little bit of humor in these essays. And we were sitting around kvetching about light bulbs for a long time. And this was an Obama era initiative to reduce carbon emissions through the energy that's expended in both in lighting your apartments and streets and all these things. But it turns out that it's really only about 5% of total U.S. energy use, lighting. So again, this is an issue where there was a huge amount of political capital expended to change a very minor thing. And the result of that is a real reduction in quality of life that's noticeable. And if you spend time in institutions that are forced to use LED bulbs, like schools, hospitals, those places are these. The lighting is like the lighting of the apocalypse. I mean, it's so dead. This is also, of course, the light that comes from our computer screens. We're bathed in this cool light all the time. It's actually not. It's been shown. Studies have been done that show that it increases stress levels. It does. You can't really sleep by it. You also can't read text by it, which is something that hasn't been, I think, adequately discussed. So this is a classic example of a top-down government thing that pleases both sides of the government doesn't work narrative. Because the Republicans, if you were a climate change denier or if you were a big government hater, you would say, I don't want these. Why is the government intruding into my life with these light bulbs? Or if and you would be right in a certain sense, because again, it's only 5% of total U.S. energy use. It's not a lot. If everybody switched over to these things, it's a very minor thing. So, nevertheless, there's part of the dominant model of ecology that we learned, I think, growing up, in the U.S. in the 70s and is that ecology somehow has to be joyless. You're conserving, you're not, you're sacrificing. And so the light bulb thing plays into the Puritan Protestant ethic that makes people think, unless it's inconvenient, we're not really saving the earth. But the fact is that it's inconvenient and you're not saving the earth really anyway. So I think government, as it's planning these interventions, should understand that they don't really need to impose an ascetic tax on people, and there's a kind of way to joyfully save the earth, and those are the ways that we should be looking at.
Do we currently have the resources to save ourselves from the worst aspects of climate change? And is that window of opportunity closing, that we now have the resources, but we may not have those resources for long?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. I'm just a writer and an editor and a researcher. But what I have read, I think the Robert Pollan essay in the New Left Review that I cite in the piece does make a very strong case that we do have right now the available alternative energy technologies, and it's a question of scaling them. And the scale, for a while, solar was looking very good, and it was very competitive. It was, of course, undermined by Trump's tariffs because there were solar companies that were cooperating between the U.S. and China and Europe. Those cooperations may now be at risk. It seemed like we were going to get to the point where cheap solar was a real thing. Hydroelectric power is a real thing. Probably. Pollan argues that we would still need to use nuclear energy, which I know makes people very nervous. So if you take the solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear quartet, it seems, yes, we actually have very much the resources available to switch away from carbon fuels. And his model suggests that you could do this by taking I forget what it's a fraction of global GDP that amounts to about $1 trillion a year, and invest it. So this, some organization would have to run this, probably the UN. It would basically collect a global GDP tax and put all of that money into switching the grid, basically. And he says that by mid-century, that would put us on track to have a fully non-carbon-based economy. I hope that's true. I hope he's right.
Bob has been on our show in the past. Bob Pollan. You also cite a couple of other past guests on our show, Elizabeth Colbert and Kate Aronoff. So our listeners who are familiar with their work, they can find in your writing as well. If information can't fight climate change, what can?
Am I saying that information can't fight climate change? I think information alone is never the answer. I think if I suggested that any attempt to inform the public is useless, I take that back. Obviously, we need to inform. The question is, what do you when you've reached a certain point where it's clear that you've been informing people at the top, the policymakers, the people running for office, the people who are then put in charge of various departments, and they're not listening. At that point, it's not an information problem. It's a political will problem, and the only thing that's going to help is making sure that these people are not in office or anywhere near power. And I think the way there are various ways to do that. I think actually what we would need in certain ways is more information. I mean, somebody needs to start running on a real profound climate change campaign. I think everyone is scared of being Al Gore. But I think we need to remember that Al Gore himself didn't really run on environmental issues in 2000 because they weren't that present then. So he played down the stuff that became the inconvenient truth when he was running for office. And so we haven't really tested what a candidate running on a Green New Deal platform would look like. I mean, AOC, great as she didn't run on a Green New Deal when she was running for Congress. That's something she brought in after she won. It would be interesting to see what someone running on those issues would do, and what a campaign based around that would be like. And that obviously would be based on informing the voters and combating some of the nonsense that comes at them. Mostly, the issue has been downplayed electorally. I mean, in the sense that Republicans don't, Trump didn't run against, he wasn't running on a platform of, hey, we're going to bust the carbon limits through the roof, but nobody really challenged him either on why he wanted to increase carbon emissions. I mean, nobody, it would be a simple question to ask in a debate to say, why do you want to increase carbon emissions? What's the value of increasing carbon emissions? Because everything that's not an amelioration at this point is an increase in carbon emissions. So I think every politician needs to answer, why do they want to increase carbon emissions?
One last question for you, Marco. We have been speaking with senior and founding editor of N+1 magazine, Marco Roth. He is the lead writer of an article by N+1's editors, The Best of a Bad Situation. This is what extinction feels like from the inside, which appears in Overtime, the winter 2019 edition of N+1. You can find all the writing of N+1 at n+1mag.com. That's NPLUSONEMAG.com. As we do for all of our guests, Marco, our final question is the question from hell, the question we might hate to answer, you might hate to answer, we might hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. Does belief in the immortal soul lead to climate change?
That is the question from hell. There's a sense in which, my wife would say, "What do you mean by soul? Let us talk about our understanding of the soul." I don't think it has to, but I think one of the kind of secret the secret sauce in persistent climate change denial, even among very educated people, is this belief in some kind of human immortality. It could be the immortality of the soul. It could also be immortality through culture, through literature. So even people who don't believe in the immortality of the soul believe that their works will live on after them. And climate change threatens actually the idea. If you want to think profoundly about an apocalyptic end to human civilization, you cannot have your works. Nobody's going to be around to read your novel. Nobody's going to be around to read Proust so you would have to start really fantasizing about things like maybe there'll be maybe we'll create intelligent robots, and it will be like the end of Spielberg Kubrick AI, where the intelligent robots will be non-carbon based. They don't have to breathe oxygen, and somewhere in their files will be all of world history and literature, and that's a form of collective immortality. But humans love to fantasize about forms of collective immortality. I think obviously if you believe that after you die, your soul will zoom off somewhere into another universe or another galaxy, and there's a home for it, then you might be less attached to the idea of Earth continuing. But that's there within religious movements. I mean, one should say that the religious movements have actually done a very good job. Some of them, I mean, even the Catholic Church, bad as it is, has Pope Francis is more progressive on climate change than most of the leaders of nations right now. So I can't condemn. I'm not going to use this as a platform to say religion is bad. But the one thing that if you think seriously about climate change, you have to think about the ways in which your own fantasies of immortality, whether that's immortality of the soul, whether that's immortality of works, allow you to kind of put off the reckoning with what is quite close to happening now. So every day that you go through that, you're like, I just wrote somebody's going to read this, and somebody's going to listen to this radio show in 20 years. No, they might not. You got to do stuff now.
Well, on that happy thought, Marco, I really appreciate you being on the show. This is a fantastic conversation. The article is really amazing. And as I said, you cite a lot of the past guests on our show who we've discussed climate change with, economics in the past, labor in the past. So really appreciate you being on the show, and great work over at N+1, and count on us bugging you in the future to have you back on the show.
Great. Thank you so much. Those were really tough questions. I feel baked over the coals.
Sweet. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.